and that can be forgiven because funny enough, we don't spend a lot of advertising dollars on ourselves. People sometimes want to call us an agency. Other people would think of us as maybe a consultancy. We look at what we do as filling a need in the space. There is a gap right now on the services side of the business. And for somebody that spent most of my career in technology, I experience this in a very real way because all of the big tech companies are starting to pull back from the services space. MightyHive is designed to help marketers take control. Sometimes that means in-housing, which is a big umbrella term that seems to apply to a lot of different things. More often it just means helping marketers understand the underlying tech and make the best decisions for them about tech contract ownership, data ownership. And so we have a variety of models that we work with marketers on. The reason that MightyHive is as successful as it is, and honestly the reason that I'm here and my job is to look after and develop the people. MightyHive's approach to talent is unlike anything I've ever seen in my career. We look for people that are not just intellectually curious and have, the analytical desire to work in the space. You need not know programmatic for some of our more junior roles, but we look for people who are not satisfied to not understand why. And so when you join MightyHive, you're joining a crew of people who are very, very dedicated to the cause and are here not just to trade programmatic media, but they're here to build careers. And you're going to meet some of them today. Tonight is about attribution, and these folks are going to tell you more than I ever could about attribution. So I am going to let them tell you a whole lot about attribution, and we hope to make this conversational. And thank you for coming.
So to start us off, tell me about an interesting attribution problem that you've helped a client to crack and still be in progress. Would love to hear about just the process overall. So we can start with you, Ben.
Sure. So one of the clients that I work with, they have this very pragmatic goal of being less wrong, which I really like. It may sound a little bit ambiguous, but I think that's actually a really good way to think about attribution because there's never really a final end state to it. As the business changes, attribution always changes. So you should always sort of be thinking about it from the perspective of being less wrong. So one of the first things we did when we started working with this client was they wanted to move away from their last touch model. So we identified how we would shift to a fractional attribution model. So certain percentage of credit going to different touch points along the path. And that was really successful with them. They really liked that as opposed to last touch. And it was better in helping them allocate budget to different channels. But of course they want to get even better. And so now the challenge for us has really been to find a model that works not only within programmatic specifically, but also with multi-channel. And that hasn't been easy. We're still kind of trying to crack that. We're running up against technical issues, product limitations, cost reporting issues, how we're actually getting costs ingested from various sources, and then getting buy-in from other teams that maybe don't have the same priorities as us.
Yeah, I've also faced interesting challenges. Currently working with a client that does all brand awareness campaigns, absolutely no retargeting, but their KPIs are return on investment and sales. So how do you come up with an attribution model when their campaigns, that's not their main objective? So we started working with offline and online sales data such as Nielsen and other data providers to come up with an MTA model, but also working with the platforms directly to make sure that we're always implementing sales lift studies, constantly ingesting that data, not only from the platforms themselves, as Ben says, that can cause its own issues, but also making sure that third-party vendors are giving us their data so that we don't get biased data across all the multi-channels that we're touching.
Yeah, I'm actually working on an interesting problem right now with a client where we're trying to help them develop what KPI they should be looking to in their day-to-day activation. So they're actually rather advanced when it comes to measurement and attribution. They're able to pack back in, revenue and match it back to at least, a pretty granular level of their media activity. And then, of course, they also have an MTA partner that they work with for, monthly or quarterly reporting. But what they're really looking for is what do they do on the day-to-day, right? Like what do they set their campaigns to optimize to that is going to end up also being reflected in that direction, right? In those other reports. So what we're coming up with them for right now is helping them coming up with a framework for them to evaluate. Okay, well, how does this KPI tie back to your business goals, your marketing objectives, right? And how does that make sure that all of these things ladder up properly, right? So it doesn't make much sense to have, say, optimize towards clicks, right? If you only sell things offline, right? So what's the point of driving the user to this, or optimizing towards driving the user to the site if most of your revenue is generated in a store? Instead, what you might like to optimize towards is awareness studies, brand studies, something like of that nature. And so that's sort of what we're coming up with. We're not necessarily dictating the KPI to them, but more building that framework of how to think about it, how to process these questions, and how to evaluate all these KPIs at the end, because it could differ by channel or by campaign or by media objective.
Take that a little bit further. When you're working with a client on developing a custom attribution model, what are some of the first steps that you think are important to take with that client in assessing what's already existing in their process?
Just going off the back of that is making sure they know what their KPIs are. It's so interesting how many clients, when you ask them that question, they just freeze. I think that's the first thing you need to make sure they understand. Making sure you understand what platforms they're running across, that's really going to be integral in deciding on what your MTA model is going to be. And then just also making sure that there's buy-in from all teams. I think a lot of times someone who really understands what MTA is will completely understand that you have to have brand awareness in mid-funnel and lower funnel, whereas someone who's not as intimately exposed to what those different things are might just think, let's put all of our money into last touch because that's what makes it seem like that's what's giving our conversions, and not understanding that all of them work together.
Which is a lot of advertisers.
It's a lot, yeah.
I think it's sort of going back to what I was saying earlier. It really comes down to structuring the problem in such that you're aligning the business goals with the marketing objectives and then the media KPIs, right? Because if you do that, it starts to bring to light a lot of important problems that you need to consider with your attribution model. So take, for example, if you have a marketing objective of driving in-store sales, like we were talking about earlier. That means that whatever attribution model you put together needs to start to take into consideration offline sales attribution, right? How are you going to pipe in that offline sales data to your online media? Or, for example, you have a client that's trying to drive awareness in key regions. Then you need to make sure that whatever attribution model you're using has the granularity necessary to be able to pinpoint which geographically specific regions you're targeting, right? So that's sort of where I'd start with a problem, is by tying it down to the full funnel and to the full objective.
The way that I kind of think about it is, ideally attribution should be a way to better allocate your media dollars. But there can sometimes be like secondary goals for certain channels, and you kind of have to incorporate that in your discussions with the client. Also, like what tool is most helpful to get the best attribution model. Like for example, if a client has a very social heavy budget, then maybe Campaign Manager isn't the best tool to use for that. And then also is like the client, do they have any current solution in place? Are they piping in data to like one particular vendor, or is a completely new solution needed? Those are some of the sort of first places that we start, or at least I start.
So taking a step back even further, why is attribution so difficult in the first place? Is it tech? Is it the client's business model? Is it unrealistic expectations on the client side? And how do we handle all of that?
From my standpoint, I think it's tech. I think that in the ecosystem, a lot of players want to have their specific value, and so they put up walls, or they're unwilling to share data or unwilling to share it in certain ways. And it's also impacted by policy too, like with Google deprecating the user ID as a result of the public's perception on privacy and regulations like GDPR. And then another is there's no North Star, I think, for a lot of advertisers to look to that isn't last touch. So it can be a little bit risky or intimidating for them to look at a model that's not last touch. And there's no really kind of benchmark there that fits every business. So that can be really hard to move away from as a result.
Yeah, I agree. It's tech. I think it's also what I was saying earlier. Client expectations are more so client education on what MTA is and how it all works together. They're very caught on last touch, or this is what drives conversions. Let's put more money here, and not understanding that it's actually the whole ecosystem that's actually driving the conversions.
What I fundamentally believe, and this is sort of the data scientist here talking, but I fundamentally believe that every model should be evaluated by a person. Every model needs that human verification to double check, to gut check if it's making sense, right? And if you do that, you don't get instances where, say, for example, you have a client or you have an MTA model that's recommending a mass reach partner with sub 20% viewability and plus 30% frequency, right? And that's, it's not always the case, but large time that's because the model that they're using just isn't penalizing false positives harshly enough, which you need to when you have instances of mass reach partners or mass frequency partners.
Getting down to platforms and partners that we all know and love, what are some challenges that you found with attribution in terms of walled gardens and how you account for that in multi-touch attribution?
I can take this because I work mostly in social media, so I'm very aware that things like Facebook are hard to put into an MTA model. Previously worked on a client who only wanted to use Campaign Manager, so there was no way for us to look into the Facebook data. So they came up with an interesting solution, which I think it worked well. It put everyone on the same playing field, but they found within Campaign Manager the average conversion rate that was split across all partners that Campaign Manager could read, and then applied that percentage to our Facebook data. It was an interesting model. Not sure how accurate it was, but it seemed to work for the client at the time. Currently, on a different client, they are working with third-party vendors, which I think is probably the best way to go. Each tag is wrapped, so it's not relying just on Facebook data. It is the third-party vendor data, and different MTA models will pull all of that data in. It can go across Google products, social media products. Some of it's still not integrated with Twitter yet. I think we're in the Facebook alpha and beta, but at least the tech partners out there and the third-party vendors out there know that this is an issue, and they're starting to come up with solutions for it.
Tracking limitation is a big one, and really being able to pipe in data to get to a single source of truth. So like what Emma's talking about is like you may have ideal tracking for programmatic and you may have ideal tracking for social, but then the challenge becomes setting up a place that can best ingest them both and then point to that as your source of truth. And it's difficult too when vendors use their own reporting, and then you get into a situation where you're relying on two sources of truth, and that's not great. Or maybe even the client isn't willing to be transparent amongst vendors, and so that can be difficult when different numbers are being used.
So you can talk us through some ways in which you actually are able to marry some of these disparate data sources.
Okay, so right now we're working on a potential cloud solution. So that's definitely a work in progress, and the challenge there has sort of become how can we get impression level data across all the different vendors. And that's something we're still working on, but we've made headway. And now I think it's how do we crunch those numbers and really put them together in a digestible way for the client to use.
Yeah, we're working with different data providers such as Datarama to make sure that all of our data is going into one place. That doesn't help what Ben was talking about, how it's still the data from each vendor. So it's going to be a little bit skewed, but then also applying things like third-party MTA solutions and all of our sales lift studies that we have going, and then looking at that data as a whole each quarter.
We've done some interesting work in helping clients onboard their first-party data in order to be available to all of these attribution systems. And obviously, the most straightforward answer is, okay, well, just use an onboarding partner, right? But then you see match rates of 30, 40%, maybe, if that. But we actually did some interesting things where we combined several different approaches So there was one case where we modeled out. We started out with an onboarding partner, right? For records not matched, we modeled out using some third-party data and also some data from the DMP, some second-party data partnerships. This was a client that had some pretty close connections within the space, and then sort of rounded that out by amplifying that with first-party login information and married that to the offline data where possible, and that produced much more indicative results in the MTA because then we're looking at 70, maybe 80% of the data as opposed to 20 or 30.
That pretty much wraps up our panel, and I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. You know where to find us to do some informal Q&A. We'll be by the bar. Maybe there's some pizza left. Just a reminder that we are also actively recruiting, so you can talk to me or anyone else who has the yellow stripe at the top of their name tag, us MightyHivers, about that. And again, thank you very much for being here.